The road to Blackridge Inn wound through a dense forest, with pines towering like giants on either side of the highway. The afternoon sun filtered through the branches, casting dancing shadows over the car's hood. Michael kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the armrest. Sarah sat silently, gazing out the window, her eyes lost in the scenery.
"A change of scenery will do us good,"
Michael said at last, breaking the monotony of the drive. He'd said it more to convince himself than her. Sarah didn't take her eyes off the forest.
"I hope so,"
she replied, her tone brushing the edge of indifference. They had booked their stay a week earlier, on an impulse of Michael's. Their relationship had grown strained. Sarah had hinted several times that she felt unheard, that Michael seemed more married to his work than to her. The hotel's ad had popped up in his feed like a sign, a retreat in the mountains, without Wi-Fi or modern distractions. Perfect for disconnecting and reconnecting, the ad had promised. When they arrived, the hotel loomed before them like something out of an old postcard. Its dark wooden facade bore the marks of age but retained an air of grandeur. The windows reflected the sunlight like glassy eyes, and a worn stone staircase led to the main entrance, flanked by two empty planters.
"It's older than I expected,"
Sarah commented as she stepped out of the car. Michael forced a nervous smile.
"It has character. Come on, it'll be fun."
Inside, the lobby greeted them with a rush of cool air and the scent of aged wood. A grand chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals dulled by dust. Behind the reception desk stood an older woman, her hair perfectly pinned and her lips painted a deep red. She greeted them with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes.
"Welcome to the Blackridge Inn. I'm Margaret, the manager. I hope you find our hotel cozy."
Michael and Sarah exchanged a quick glance. Margaret's voice was firm, almost theatrical, as if she were used to addressing an invisible audience. She handed them their room keys and gave them directions.
"We're rather empty this season,"
Margaret added, turning to put something away behind the desk.
"You'll have all the peace and quiet you need."
Their room was on the second floor, overlooking the forest. When they opened the door, they were greeted by a small but cozy space, a double bed with a carved wooden headboard, a desk by the window, and a worn but clean rug. Michael dropped the suitcases by the bed and stretched.
"Well, it's not too bad,"
he said, trying to sound enthusiastic. Sarah didn't respond. She stood by the window, looking out at the forest. The sunset bathed her face, highlighting the pensive expression she had worn throughout the journey.
"Everything okay?"
Michael asked as he walked over. Sarah sighed.
"It's just a little more isolated than I expected."
Michael wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder.
"That's a good thing, right? A little solitude for us."
Sarah nodded, though she didn't seem convinced. The first night, Michael woke with a start. Something had interrupted his sleep, though he couldn't tell what. He sat up in bed, glancing around. Sarah lay peacefully beside him, her face serene in deep slumber. The room was completely dark, save for the faint moonlight streaming through the window. Through the glass, he could see the treetops swaying gently in the wind, but something about the shadows unsettled him. They seemed to move with more purpose than the casual sway of branches. He got up to drink water from the small glass on the desk. As he did, he noticed the silence. It was absolute. There were no insects, no rustling leaves, no hum of distant wind. Just a deafening void. The next morning, Sarah noticed something strange. As they walked toward the dining room for breakfast, she stopped in front of one of the large mirrors lining the hallway.
Michael, look at this.
She said, pointing to the glass. He stepped closer, peering at their reflection.
What is it?
Sarah gestured behind them.
Look at the painting in the hallway.
The painting in question depicted a mountain landscape. Oddly, in the mirror, the painting appeared slightly tilted, as though hanging at an uneven angle. Michael blinked, puzzled. When he turned to look at the painting directly, it was perfectly straight.
It's probably just some weird effect from the glass,
he said, trying to sound rational. But a gnawing sense of unease settled in his chest. Over the next few nights, Michael began to have recurring nightmares. He dreamt of endless corridors stretching in every direction. He ran, always pursued by a shadow he could never quite see. In his dreams, a voice whispered incessantly,
"You are not alone."
Sarah began to change as well. She spent hours gazing out the window into the forest, murmuring words Michael couldn't understand. One afternoon, when he tried to pull her from her trance, she turned to him slowly and said,
The lights in the forest, they're watching us.
What lights?
Michael asked, baffled. Sarah didn't answer. On their fourth night at the hotel, Michael woke abruptly to a noise. It was a dull thud, like something heavy falling nearby. He turned to Sarah's side of the bed, expecting to find her there, but the space was empty.
Sarah,
he whispered, his voice barely audible. No response. He got up, rubbing his eyes, and slipped on his shoes. The room was dimly lit, with only a faint glow coming from the gap beneath the door. Michael stepped out into the hallway, hoping to find her nearby, but the corridor was deserted. He walked slowly, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Each step made the wooden floor creak, amplifying the eerie silence. When he reached the end of the hall, he turned toward the main lounge, where a faint flickering light caught his attention. There she was. Sarah sat in front of a massive window, her gaze fixed on the forest outside. She didn't seem to notice his presence.
Sarah, what are you doing here?
He asked, approaching cautiously. At first, she didn't respond. Her lips moved, whispering something too soft to hear. Michael leaned closer, straining to make out the words.
They won't stop. They're waiting for us.
What are you saying?
Michael asked, a chill running down his spine. Sarah finally turned to look at him. Her eyes were glassy, as if she were in a trance. Then she smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes.
The hotel chose us, she said softly.
Michael stepped back, his pulse quickening.
What are you talking about? Come on, let's go back to bed. This isn't good for you.
Sarah didn't argue. She stood silently and followed him back to the room. But that night, Michael couldn't sleep. Sarah stayed awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, staring out the window. She didn't speak or move, she simply watched. In the days that followed, her behavior grew increasingly unsettling. She woke before dawn, left the room, and wandered the hotel for hours. Michael tried to follow her a couple of times but always ended up losing her in the labyrinthine hallways. Whenever he found her, she was at a window, gazing into the forest.
There's something out there, Michael.
She told him one morning over breakfast.
What? It's just trees.
You don't understand. They're calling to us.
Michael sighed in frustration.
This is getting ridiculous, Sarah. We're leaving tomorrow.
Sarah stared at him, her intensity sending a shiver down his spine.
Leaving? We can't leave. Not yet.
Michael made up his mind to leave the hotel that very night. As Sarah slept, he began packing their belongings, hurriedly stuffing everything into the suitcases. The atmosphere in the room felt stifling, as though the air had grown heavier than usual. When he finished, he turned to wake Sarah, but she wasn't there.
Sarah?
He called out, scanning the room. Panic set in as he stepped into the hallway, desperate to find her. He hurried through the corridors, his footsteps echoing loudly in the suffocating silence. At every turn, he felt eyes on him, as though something unseen lurked in the shadows. Then he heard it, a humming sound. It was a familiar melody, Sarah's favorite song. Michael followed the sound, his heart pounding, until it led him to a door at the end of the third floor's last hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and warm light seeped through the crack. With his heart in his throat, he opened the door and entered. As he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut. He desperately tried to open it, but it didn't budge. The door didn't move an inch. Then the voice with the familiar song returned. Michelle decided to continue and go like this. The voice. The room was incredibly big, much bigger than it should have been, like it didn't belong in the hotel. The light came from a flickering lamp that cast twisted shadows on the walls. Michael moved cautiously toward the kitchen area, where he saw her, Sarah, standing by the island, her back to him. She was humming the melody, her movements rhythmic as she worked with a large knife on a cutting board.
Sarah, what are you doing?
Michael asked, his voice trembling. She didn't respond, continuing to hum as the knife moved in steady strokes.
Sarah, we need to leave. This isn't right.
He insisted, taking a hesitant step closer. The humming stopped abruptly. Without turning, she spoke in a calm but unnatural voice.
Why don't you wash your hands? Dinner is almost ready.
Michael's gut churned with dread. Every instinct screamed for him to run, but he couldn't move. Then he noticed something on the floor behind the kitchen island, a lump. Carefully, he approached the lump. It was Sarah. She lay sprawled on the floor, her skin pale, her eyes wide open in a frozen expression of terror. Michael stumbled back, horrified, and turned his gaze to the figure standing at the counter.
Who are you?
He demanded, his voice breaking. The figure dropped the knife onto the table with a dull thud. Slowly, it turned its head toward him. It had Sarah's face, but it was wrong, its features stretched and warped, as if its skin had been pulled in impossible directions.
Why, Michael?
The figure said, its voice shifting unervingly between soft and deep.
Why don't you ever listen to me?
Its smile widened grotesquely, extending far beyond what was natural, as black tears began streaming down its distorted cheeks. The figure started to sob, but the sound was twisted, interspersed with eerie, mocking laughter. Michael stumbled backward, tripping over a chair. The figure advanced, arms outstretched. The lights began to flicker violently, and the room filled with the humming sound, louder and louder, accompanied by a laughter that seemed to echo from everywhere at once.